There was a time when there were as yet no birds, a time before there were any dinosaurs, before there were even reptiles in any form. Though there were things that looked like reptiles, being almost but not quite reptiles, and some regarded as para-reptiles, on the side of reptiles. And there were other things that looked like reptiles that were never going to be reptiles, but that instead led to mammals, and to other intermediate forms that you've probably never heard of, and it would have looked unfamiliar and disturbingly alien, like a cross or blend between reptiles and mammals, but being neither one and somehow also a bit of both. Otherwise, most terrestrial vertebrates were seemingly similar to salamanders, albeit of enormous size in many cases. There were also snakes of a sort, with no relation to actual snakes, these being more like amphibians playing the role of snakes, albeit without venom. Such was the late Carboniferous period of rainforest wetlands moving into the drier Permian period with a climate of temperature, humidity, and oxygen levels that was at least initially more like what we have today. That's when we were in the last episode. The end of the Permian period was the end of the Paleozoic era, and it ended with what is popularly considered to be the worst extinction level event ever, wherein more than 85% of all life on land, and that was like 95% of life in the sea, died out in an unprecedented global warming catastrophe. It was caused by a flood basalt eruption. And there have been a few of these type volcanic eruptions in geologic history, but none of them have ever happened in human history, not while people were alive, which is good, because every flood basalt eruption is tied to a mass extinction. And this one was the biggest ever, so big that it covered an area the size of Australia, or the continental United States. It occurred in what is now Siberia, although at that time the continents were connected together in a single supercontinent called Pangaea. Over the course of the Triassic period of the Mesozoic era, this giant omnicontinent broke into two main pieces. The northern supercontinent of Laurasia had North America connected to the Eurasian continental plate, except for India, which was then part of the southern supercontinent Gondwana, along with South America, Africa, and Australasia. The water that then existed between them was called the Tethys Sea. It was technically an ocean, and a big one, but the Tethys Ocean doesn't have the same ring to it. In the previous episode of the series, we looked at the earliest tetrapods, and we talked about how all of these things that were amphibious diversified into actual amphibians, true amphibians, like frogs and salamanders. And we talked about the emergence and divergence of amniotes, with synapsids eventually leading to mammals, and anapsids leading to parareptiles. We also looked at the earliest divisions of true reptiles, what we call sauropsids. We, in modern times, like to divide the reptile family tree into two main groups, Lepidosaurs and Archosaurs, with turtles kind of down the middle, but grouped alongside Archosaurs in a clade called Archelosauria. Within that are Archosauromorphs of various types divided into three parent clades, only one of which, true Archosaurs, has any modern survivors. We'll talk about Archosaurs, those that made it and those that didn't, in a subsequent, probably series of videos. Yet today, we'll talk about another one of their sister clades, one that doesn't exist at all anymore. If you study zoology, you'll see that there is much greater variety of animals than you might have guessed, even though they're all in relatively few parent categories. For example, if you look at Lepidosauromorpha, you'll see 7,000 species of lizards, which would be even more if we were to include 3,000 species of snakes, which are a specialized derivation of lizards. So that's roughly 10,000 species in the order Squamata. But again, those are just the ones that are still alive today. That's not including the fossil record. And most animal species typically last around 5 million years on average, and the order Squamata has been around for 240 million years, since the early Triassic. So lizards are almost as old as dinosaurs. Remember the Mosasaurus in Jurassic Park movies? That was just one species from a clade of many giant lizards that lived alongside the dinosaurs and also went extinct along with them too. But Lepidosauria isn't just lizards. Alongside squamates are sphenodonts, represented by just one genus, commonly known as the adorable Tuatara. So 10,000 squamates balanced against only 2 Atara. But if you look into the fossil record, you'll see that modern sphenodonts are just the last surviving genus of some 50 or so ranchocephalian genera, dating back to the late Triassic period. So if you study paleontology, you'll discover that no matter how many animal forms there are now, there used to be a whole lot more than that. In the previous episode, we also looked at one side of the other side of the reptile family tree, Archelosauria, wherein we explored the evolution of turtles. So we have lizards and snakes and the Tuatara on one branch and turtles kind of on their own branch, close to Archosaurs. And all the Archosaurs we have left alive in the world today are just crocodilians and birds. Which may seem strange because birds don't look much like crocodiles. But there were many more varieties with myriad intermediates in the fossil record, enough to bridge even that gap. And we'll see different examples of that all through this series and the next one. Today's episode looks at an as-yet unnamed clade unifying Ichthyosaurs, Sauropterygians, and Thalattosaurs, all of which are now entirely extinct. Each of these did like the Mesosaurs did in the last episode, where they returned to the water, becoming at least semi-aquatic if not fully marine. They were adapted to the land, but began readapting to the sea, which has happened several times. Whales, manatees, mosasaurs, mesosaurs, turtles, pinnipeds, desmostallions, crocodilians, and more. And each of these 3 groups, Ichthyosaurs, Sauropterygians, and Thalattosaurs, are associated with an early Triassic radiation of reptiles into the Tethys Sea. Remember, this is right after the end Permian extinction that began the Triassic. So those few surviving groups diverged into myriad forms in a world full of new opportunities, largely left vacant. The Tethys was a vast ocean that doesn't exist anymore. Try to imagine that. How does an ocean disappear? Now, tectonic plate movement eventually eliminated that sea between 50 million and 34 million years ago. What is now India and Pakistan together used to be an island unto itself. It was originally part of Gondwana to the south, but when that supercontinent broke apart into each of the continents we know now, the Indian continental plate surged northward rapidly, moving at 7 or 8 inches a year until it rammed into Eurasia. And the crumple of that impact, which is still ongoing, pushed the seafloor between them skyward, forming the Himalayan mountains, which is still rising by a couple centimeters or 4/5 of an inch every year. That's why you can find seashells on Mount Everest. This collision of continental plates also raised the Arabian Peninsula and surrounding areas above sea level. So there is no between India and Eurasia anymore. They're viewed as one continent now. And all of this connects to Africa, where there used to be an ocean between them. Back in the early Triassic period, when we're talking about now, Europe wasn't so much a continent as a vast chain of islands in the Tethys, before there was a Mediterranean Sea. Because at that time, what is now the Mediterranean used to extend into what is now the Indian Ocean, because Egypt, Arabia, and Iran were all underwater too, or at least mostly so. They were under the Tethys. And that's where a lot of these fossils were found. Southern Europe, Iran, Egypt, and so on. Now you might think that the Mediterranean Sea is the last remnant of the Tethys Sea, but no, because there was a time around 6 million years ago when the Mediterranean basin was mostly dry. So there wasn't always water there. Since Ichthyosaurs, Thalattosaurs, and Sauropterygians are all apparently part of a larger clade which doesn't yet have an official name, then I'm going to suggest that we refer to them all collectively as Tethysauropsids, meaning reptiles of the Tethys Sea. I would just call them Tethysauros, but there's already a mosasaur called Tethysauros, which is not part of this group and would just confuse people. And one of the difficulties some people have in learning about evolution is conceptualizing how it is an aspect of biodiversity, where one form branches into 2 or more daughter sets, and that they themselves branch into other descendant subsets that are increasingly distinct from their cousins, but still just modified versions of whatever their ancestors were, rather than the notion of one thing changing into or giving birth to another fundamentally different kind of thing, which is what a lot of people get wrong. So let's look at the origins of Tethysauropsids. What did they all come from? Their common ancestor was not terribly different from the origin of lizards and sphenodonts. They all have that general lizard look. It's the subtle differences between them, like how their skulls suture together, or how their teeth differ, or postcranial clues in their vertebrae, or limb joints, or pelvis that vary slightly from group to group that puts them in these other categories. It's these subtle differences that say that this lizard is a lizard, but this other lizard-like thing is a thalattosaur, and that one is a Sauropterygian, and this other one is another archosauromorph just outside of this group that we'll talk about next time. They all start out as basically the same. The most primitive members of each group look more like each other than they do later members of their own groups. In fact, there is often more diversity within taxonomic groups than between them. So let's look at how they started out so similar and grow apart from there. We'll start with Thalattosaurs, the most lizard-like of all of these. So much so that their name means ocean lizards. Pioneer paleontologists once classified these alongside lizards as lepidosaurs because some of them really do look like monitor lizards or even mosasaurs at first glance. Though if you look close, you'll see that these are something else entirely. Their faces often come to a sharp point, or the upper jaw turns downward with unique teeth as well, in what seems to be a feeding or maybe fighting adaptation or specialization that is not yet understood. Thalattosaurs diverged into two basic groups based on their apparent affinity to either Askeptosaurus or Thalattosaurus, which were among the first ones found, though dozens of other species have been unearthed since then. They started out with free-moving toes that were probably webbed, but more derived versions turned those into flippers, where the toes could not move independently anymore, and where the animal is at least clumsy and vulnerable on land, if it can crawl back out of the water at all. This was also the case with their sister group, Sauropterygians, a name that means lizard flippers. Just as Thalattosaurs were once classified alongside lizards in the early days of paleontology, so were Sauropterygians once classed alongside turtles. But to be fair, their roots are very close together, and their earliest progenitors do look superficially similar. Like Thalattosaurs, Sauropterygia began with a typically lizard-like ancestor and quickly diverged into two distinct forms. On one side, we have Placodonts, so called because while it still had regular pointed teeth like most lizards, it also had huge, broad, crushing teeth in its palate. This is the most diagnostic trait of Placodonts, who apparently used their wider, duller teeth to crush the shells of bivalves and brachiopods. This general type of animal led to heavy-bodied bottom feeders like Placodus. Its only defense appears to be dermal armor, which other Placodonts expanded upon. As you can see, some Placodonts looked a bit like turtles, at least at first glance. However, if you look closer, you'll see that they are quite different. Their shells were made of hexagonal osteoderms, like turtles have, but that developed individually initially and eventually sutured together in a way that is different from turtles and even different from other Placodonts. In the case of Henotus, for example, its osteoderms grew into one massive shell of a type that would have been invulnerable if it just sat flat on the sea floor, which it could do because their bones were so heavy and dense that they sank to the bottom where they wanted to be anyway. Likewise, Placocheles was flattened out, possibly with the same strategy. Other Placodonts developed a segmented shell, like Cephiderma and Cyanomotus. I told you in the last episode that since we saw lizards that weren't lizards, and snakes that weren't snakes, and salamanders that weren't salamanders, that we would also look in this episode at turtles that aren't turtles. And it's not just these either. Saurophargus is from a separate group just outside of Sauropterygians that also produce their own pseudo-turtles. In another video I mentioned this weird thing about Cenozoic mammals. When you had scimitar cats that had the saber teeth, you had dirt-toothed cats, different lineages of cats that had saber teeth, but then there were also pseudo-cats with saber teeth. Cats that they look like cats, but they're not true cats. And that was around the same time. And then there was a Metatherian, like a marsupial with saber teeth. And back then, even cattle had saber teeth. It's as if it was the fashion of Cenozoic mammals to have oversized canines. Likewise, in the Permian, there were different lineages of sail-backed synapsids at the same time as there was also a sail-backed amphibian, as if it was the style of the time. And here we have the same thing going on with Triassic reptiles, because Saurophargids and Placodonts and actual turtles all existed at the same time by the late Triassic. Isn't that odd? Turtles and two sets of pseudo-turtles. Why? So Placodonts and Sinosaurophargus are both on one side of Sauropterygia. To understand the other side, Eosauropterygia, we have to go back to the original lizard form, like a thalattosaur, like a Skeptosaurus without a shell, and maybe a slightly longer neck, like Nothosaurus. Here we have that generalized lizard shape with a longer neck and ridiculous teeth for catching fish. Nothosaurus is fairly well known because it's big enough to be dangerous, and let's be honest, it's hideous. I mean, if you're looking for a sea monster, this one is monstrous. The creature from the Black Lagoon stands no chance against this thing. All of these others in this clade are variations on the same theme. Everything from Womengosaurus to Chorosaurus are cuter and smaller, but looking at some of these gives a strong hint at where we're going from here. Because members of this group pretty much define what it means to be a sea monster. When you see the word Plesiosauria, it conjures visions like the Loch Ness Monster, an iconic image capturing imagination in the public media since Fantasia. Interestingly, their method of swimming is unknown today. All their propulsion comes from their flippers, not from the tails at all. In fact, as you can see, their tails were merely rudders. Nothing alive today swims like that. So we're not entirely sure how they did it. There were several species of Plesiosaurs, from relatively small ones like Cryptoclydus to the massive Elasmosaurus. But there was more than that. There were also pliosaurs, and those were big and bad. Liplorodon was a good example of that. At 7 meters long, it was once said to be the largest predatory marine reptile ever. But then they found several other pliosaur species that were even bigger, including one that was twice as big. But the biggest ever is in a sister group that we'll see in a moment. Plesiosauria were not only large and intimidating sea monsters, but they were also quite successful, ranging from the late Triassic right to the end of the Mesozoic era, eventually dying out with the dinosaurs and mosasaurs and all of that at the end of the Age of Reptiles. So we looked at how lizard-like ancestors became sea-going Thalattosaurs, and a closely related group of these went a different way, leading to Sauropterygian sea monsters and pseudo-turtles, all from essentially the same original form. A common ancestral origin for both of these groups. And now we'll go back to that common ancestral form one more time to watch them evolve differently, this time on a third branch of Tethysauropsids. We start with the same lizard-like form as these other groups, but this one didn't develop a shell or a long neck, and rather than relying primarily on webbed feet, becoming flippers, and then steering with their tails, we're looking at some who rely on their tails for propulsion and only steer with their flippers, like most fish do. We're looking at Ichthyosaurs, a name that means fish lizards. Cardarhynchus is the earliest known ichthyosaur, and it's obviously the most primitive. It also might be the last one that could still crawl around on land, since its feet were already flippers by this point. I say crawl, but really it would just flop and struggle and try to drag itself. I find the story of ichthyosaurs to be fascinating. And not just their evolution, which is so clearly spelled out in sequential fossils. You couldn't ask for a better illustration of evolution than what this lineage provides. But they're also a fascinating story from the history of paleontology. Some of the exhibits in the Natural History Museum in London were found by Mary Anning, a pioneer paleontologist and a true amateur, someone who does what they do not because they're paid for it, but because they love doing it. And she was neither sponsored nor educated nor promoted by any institution in her time, and she was barely even tolerated by her 19th century peers in the scientific community, which is a sad story of sexism in the 19th century. The fossils she found, and for a time all the fossils known of ichthyosaurs, were thought to be like something like if primitive crocodiles had adapted to the sea such that their feet became flippers. Like with sea turtles. They can't walk around on the land anymore. They can only drag themselves, but they still have to get onto the shore to lay their eggs because they are reptiles, after all. Thus, the scientists of the 19th century imagined ichthyosaurs being like a blend of sea turtles and crocodiles, such that they lay along the shoreline to warm themselves in the shallows. It was still a mystery how they laid their eggs, because they couldn't use their flippers the same way that sea turtles do. Thus, ichthyosaurs would be better off staying out in the open ocean. So how did they reproduce? That question was answered with the discovery of a couple of fossils of ichthyosaurs who died in the act of giving birth, live birth, breech birth, just like whales do. Then those early naturalists realized that they'd gotten ichthyosaurs all wrong. They wouldn't be lazily hanging out in the shallows because that would be too dangerous for them. These guys were in the sea all their lives, never coming onto land ever at all. And there was one more aspect of ichthyosaurs that normally doesn't show up in fossils, especially not when the animal is in a typical beached position, unable to crawl on those flippers. But what if the animal washed ashore dead already, lying on its side? Then if it's quickly buried by the surf, then it's not just the bones that fossilize, but the outline of its body as well. Remember that those early paleontologists were convinced that ichthyosaurs looked like this. So imagine their surprise when they saw fossils like this. That showed how they got it all wrong. This wasn't a crocodile with turtle flippers. No, this is what you get when you try to make a dolphin out of a lizard. This image reveals an active swimmer, capable of both impressive speed and endurance. Either they were warm-blooded, or the North Sea was inexplicably warm at that time. And as it turns out, there's evidence that both of these was true. The fossil record reveals something else, too. Something that all these previous scientists overlooked. Every ichthyosaur fossil had a tail that was apparently broken in the same place and in the same way. Now they see, looking at fossils like this, that the tail bends into the lower fluke. So what had obviously happened is that early ichthyosaurs started out with a straight, flattened tail, a paddle tail like crocodiles have, but the stresses of many generations of constant swimming in open oceans, never resting on the land ever at all, gradually built up an upper fluke on that tail, pushing the lower fluke down, because every ichthyosaur fossil from the earliest to the most recent shows a degree of that evolution. It was later discovered that it wasn't just ichthyosaurs that did that. Some mosasaurs developed that shark-shaped tail in the same way, and so did a lineage of fully marine crocodiles from the Jurassic period. Swimming that way long enough causes that. In fact, fossils of ancient fish show that that's how they got that shape to their tail too, except for sharks, because the shark tail turns upward while the new unsupported fluke is on the bottom. Of course, from one original species, we eventually get sibling categories of different species. And that's what evolution is all about, biodiversity. As is typically the case, the earliest forms are pretty small, and maybe later ones get big. And we tend to think of ichthyosaurs as being typically dolphin-sized, and many of them were, but some of them got big. I mean really big as whales. They were macro-predators with more bite force than an equally sized crocodile. Macro-predators in the size range of megalodon. One of them, known as an ichthyotitan, was almost as long as a blue whale, the largest animal that has ever lived. There were dinosaurs that were longer, but the whale was far more massive. And there's evidence now that the largest animal ever might turn out to be an unconfirmed ichthyotitan. Isn't it wild that all of these animals, Thalattosaurs, Ichthyosaurs, Plesiosaurs, pliosaurs, and Placodonts, were all alive at the same time in the Triassic period? Think about the classifications of reptiles that we have today. Birds are a subset of dinosaurs. There were many types of dinosaurs, and yes, birds really are the last survivors of that clade. Dinosaurs are one subset of archosaurs, along with pterosaurs and other things, just like crocodiles are, too. So that's one group. And then lizards and snakes and rhynchocephalians are subsets of a second group, Lepidosauria. Then hundreds of species of turtles and tortoises alive today, to say nothing of all the previous species dating back 228 million years, are a third group called testudines. Every reptile alive today belongs in one of these three groups. But we've just looked at Tethysauropsids, and that is a fourth group, bigger than testudines, bigger than Lepidosauria, and comparable to Archosauria. Yet not even one species from any of their subsets has any living descendants. That's the downside of paleontology. Looking into the past portends the future. We appreciate these awesome animals and their apparent environment, impressed at how much we know about their world, yet also frustrated at what we still don't know, that we want to know. I want to see these things for myself. There's just no way to do that. Not that I want to go swimming back then. But at least we have a more accurate and a more complete picture now than what they had 100 years ago. And they knew next to nothing about any of this 100 years before that. How much better will we understand this in another 100 years or so?